Really good to see all of you. There are people from all over the world here, London and Vancouver, and let's see, where else are you guys from? Well, Toronto, that's not quite as exciting since I live here. Quebec, Calgary, Edmonton, Vienna, Boston, Auckland, New Zealand, Montreal, Texas. There we go. Morocco, Netherlands. Yeah, it's amazing that this can this can happen like that, as far as I'm concerned. So, okay, first question. What is your advice for finding a sane, sound therapist? Well, I would say with regards to finding a sane and sound therapist, there's some practical things you can do. I guess this is more relevant if you live in North America, and I'm not sure exactly what the training requirements are in other places in the world, but your best bet, I would say, is to find someone who's appropriately trained, and I would regard someone who's appropriately trained as a psychotherapist to be someone who's, I think you're safer if you go with someone who's trained at one of the big research schools and you have a therapist who's well versed in psychotherapeutic practice, but who's also sufficiently educated scientifically to be able to understand the scientific literature. And you can be pretty certain of that if you find a therapist who's got their PhD rather than a PsyD. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with PsyDs. If they received their PhD from an American Psychological Association approved school of clinical psychology. And those schools operate under what's called the Boulder model, and the Boulder model promotes what's it called? Science practitioner as the optimal ideal combination for a psychotherapist. So someone who's trained psychotherapeutically, but also has research experience and can understand the relevant scientific literature as it pertains to mental health. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is, go to see a psychotherapist once and maybe go to see a couple of them and find someone that listens to you, because the psychotherapist shouldn't be someone who solves your problems for you or really offers you advice, although sometimes that can be helpful. Really what the psychotherapist should do is be someone who can help you understand what problem it is that you're facing so that can be delineated properly, to help you articulate what it is that you want, so what your vision of mental health might be and what you'd like to attain in psychotherapy, and then who helps you strategize towards that end. And so you want someone who will really listen to you, that you feel comfortable telling the truth to, because that's also incredibly important. You have to if you can't tell your psychotherapist the truth, then you're not going to get anywhere in therapy, because you won't be able to actually outline the nature of your fundamental problems. So that's vital. And go see someone and see if you're happy with the way that you're interacting with them. That's the most relevant issue. I think it's difficult to work with a therapist who is less intelligent than you are. That's kind of a rough way of conceptualizing it, but a lot of what a therapist does is help you strategize, and the person has to be able to think analytically and probably at least to some degree with the same degree of complexity that you're capable of. It's not necessarily a good idea to be able to outthink your therapist. So was there ever a time when you saw a therapist of some kind? Well, no, actually, I haven't ever seen a therapist, and that might seem strange, I suppose, given that I am a psychologist. I don't really like talking about my problems with other people, as it turns out. I'd rather keep them to myself. And but I would say, having said that, is that I've read an awful lot of the writings of the great clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, and I would say that I've used them as psychotherapeutic aids, and I think that plays a very similar role, or that can play a very similar role. I need another question. Sometimes you have to draw a line in the sand before people are willing to undergo the serious self-consideration that would precede any real transformation. Some practical advice is, well, regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, or perhaps earlier, or perhaps a little bit later. But you want to stabilize that, because your circadian rhythms operate more, what would you call it, fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate I would say a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And because it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete to deplete the sugar in your blood, and then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be in a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplished, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest. And so I would also say that the trajectory that you're on is more important than your starting point. And that's also an extraordinarily optimistic observation, because it means that direction is more important than current position. And I mean, current position matters, obviously, but I don't think it does matter as much as direction. So if you want to learn to concentrate more, define what constitutes concentration. Break it into micro habits, and then start practicing instantiation of those micro habits. You know, if you're scared of going to parties, or maybe scared of going out in public, you can also always go to the nearest bar for 10 minutes and sit there and have a drink and then leave, you know, and then maybe expand that up to 12 minutes, and then maybe dare at one point when you go out to say hi to someone. But again, don't ever underestimate the utility of incremental improvement. You can get a tremendous distance by engaging in incremental improvement. My gut instinct, and I would use this as a good rule of thumb, is to assume ignorance or error or stupidity before you assume malevolence. What would you recommend to someone who wants to try to be productive in their free time but always gets sucked in by video games and other distractions? Well, I would say define more carefully precisely what you mean by productive. So get a plan in order, delineate the plan down to the level of a daily routine, set up a daily routine using a calendar, put in times that you're going to get sucked in by video games and other distractions, because obviously you enjoy that, and then set yourself up so that it's difficult to get access to those things. So that's the answer to that question. If it's relatively straightforward social anxiety, exposure therapy is very useful for that sort of thing, and sometimes social skills training if you don't feel that you have the skill and wherewithal to conduct yourself appropriately in a social environment. And some people weren't socialized very well, and so they don't have those skills, or they didn't get the opportunity to practice. I would say what's probably more important is that you find a therapist that you're comfortable with and who is pushing you and helping you and listening to you in the proper manner. But behavioral therapy is very, very effective for relatively straightforward issues of anxiety and skill deficit, let's say. How old was I when everything you understood started to come together? I think that really started happening to me. It started probably happening to me when I was in my early 20s. I think the most important realization I had, and I outlined this realization in my book, in the preface of my book, Maps of Meaning, that I realized at about that age that almost everything I said was a falsehood of one form or another. It was either I was using language instrumentally in order to win arguments, or to attain dominance, or to indicate that I was intelligent, or to use it for victory, for narrow, local, personal victory. And I realized that when I was in my early 20s, and I started to, because a voice, in some sense, a voice started inside my head, which I now regard as something equivalent to the cricket in Pinocchio. And it basically continually informed me that the things I was saying weren't, in some fundamental sense, weren't true. And it was very disquieting, because the voice that was commenting on what I was saying was making comments of that sort. I wouldn't call them disparaging voices. It was more just a matter-of-fact commentary. But it was saying it about 95% of what I was saying. And I thought, well, that's a strange conundrum, because now I don't know if I'm the voice that's criticizing what I'm saying, or if I'm the thing that's saying what's being criticized. How do you figure that out? But I decided that I would take a chance and assume that the part that was suggesting that I wasn't saying things truthfully was accurate, and I started to practice only saying things that voice wouldn't object to. And I think that's also equivalent to some degree to trying to say only those things that make you strong instead of weak, or that make you that do not fill you with a post-speech sense of shame and regret. And I really think that was the beginning of all of this. About this, it was at the same time, though, that I was starting to work on the problem that I think has obsessed my entire life, which is, what's the pathway between nihilism and totalitarianism? Like, is there a genuine pathway between those two pathological extremes? So, and I think those things wove together. I had a serious problem to solve, and I also tried to begin to sort out my language, and really to learn how to work as well. So, and that was in my early 20s. I mean, I had lots of things to straighten out in my life, many things, and I still have many things to straighten out in my life. But I think that's it. So, whenever you ask a question, and the question is of the form, is X equal to Y, the answer is always, it depends on how you define X, and it depends on how you define Y. Let's see. Jordan, Dr. Peterson, will you visit Fredericton, New Brunswick? I have visited Fredericton. I actually had quite a nice time there. I'm going to try to limit my travel to about once every 6 weeks, because I have a bunch of other obligations that I have to keep up with. And at the moment, Fredericton isn't on my travel schedule. I am releasing a book in the early part of 2018. It's called 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. And it's 12 essays that I derived from a set of answers that I gave on the website Quora to the question, what are the most valuable things that everyone should know? What are the most valuable things that everyone should know? I think I wrote 42 little rules there, and you can find them at jordanbpeterson.com. they're accompanied by photographic images that one of my viewers has kindly donated to the project. People have been doing all sorts of nice and creative things for me, helping me facilitate what I'm doing on YouTube, and they did that. The reason I mention that is because I presume that when that book is released that I'll be going on a speaking tour, and it's possible that Fredericton would be on that agenda, but I don't know because none of that has been formulated yet. So the book, I'm happy with the book. I've been writing it for about 3 years, and it's been quite thoroughly edited and commented on by my editor. Penguin Random House is publishing it in Canada, and I've had a number of friends of mine who are good authors and sometimes excellent authors review it, and so that should give me the opportunity to do some more traveling and to talk about the book. So, okay, 80% of humanities papers garner 0 citations, which means essentially that no one reads them, or if they do, they don't do anything with them. Someone says, I made the mistake of using psychedelic and recreational drugs to excess when I was young, and I'm sorry, I can't see the question right now, so I'm going to have to regenerate it from memory. And the consequence of that, I believe, is that my ability to think has become very cloudy and uncertain. And I don't know what to do about that. I would say that you should probably go talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because there are maybe things that could be done to sharpen your thinking up again, and maybe some of them, perversely enough, might be pharmacological. Perhaps, what you're describing could be a consequence of something like depression or even post-traumatic stress disorder. So, because the evidence on the long-term use of psychedelic drugs, for example, doesn't indicate that overall they produce negative health consequences of the sort that you're describing. Now, you might have had adulterated drugs. You might have been one of those people, and there do seem to be people like that who are prone to negative consequences for using various recreational drugs. But I would say, if you really think that your cognitive ability has been impaired, you should probably go talk to a psychologist or a psychiatrist and see if you can do something about that, because sometimes, for example, antidepressants or drugs like Wellbutrin, which is also an antidepressant but a different kind, can be very useful in restoring mental clarity. It's worth a shot, You don't want to go through life like that. So, okay. Nietzsche made the proposition that he said that morality is cowardice. Now, that's not exactly what he said. What he said in a more elaborated form is that very frequently people are afraid to do things, and they're often things that other people regard as bad, and because they don't want to admit to themselves that the reason they won't do those things that are regarded as bad is because they're cowardly, they pretend that it's because they're moral. And so often conventional morality is a consequence of conventional cowardice. And the problem with conventional cowardice is that it's not sufficient to solve serious problems. And so, for example, it's necessary for a man, and perhaps for a woman as well, to become a bit of a monster, or even a lot of a monster, in order to move through life successfully. And that doesn't mean precisely that you have to act out being a monster, but it means that you need to be able to be a monster when the circumstances demand it. And so the reason that anti-heroes like Walter White, for example, are so popular in American culture is because the criminal Walter White was in no obvious way less moral than the conventional and cowardly Walter White. Now, you might say he went from one extreme to another, which he did. But it's also the case that in order to expand past the domains of conventional morality / cowardice from the Nietzschean perspective, it's necessary to incorporate elements of the shadow. And that's in some sense what Nietzsche meant when he said that we need to go beyond good and evil. And it's certainly what Jung meant when he said that it's necessary for someone who wants to burst forth from the potentially pathological confines of their conventional persona into the journey towards individuation and the development of the self, was that the shadow had to be incorporated. And that means often, in part, the capacity for aggression, the capacity for sexual expression, the capacity to defy convention, the capacity to take your own road. That's all predicated on the development of an inner relationship with the monster. And it's the same idea that's expressed in Harry Potter. Harry Potter is actually able to combat Voldemort, who's essentially Satan for all intents and purposes, because he has a piece of evil lodged firmly within him. And it's also what makes him a redeeming rule breaker, right? So the anti-hero is the shadow, roughly speaking, and the shadow is the thing that the persona needs to incorporate to become the hero. All right, so I'm going to sign out here pretty quick because I'm starting to wear out and I don't want to say anything pathologically idiotic for public consumption, and that could happen, and that would be a bad thing. So, okay, so let's see. I'll answer one more question. You get better at things by doing them somewhat badly to begin with. So, anyways, thanks very much. I'll see some of you again in a month, and over and out. And thanks to Julian very much for helping me sort this out and set it up. Good night.
Other one.